My aunt scoffed. "You're too embarrassed to tell anyone why you quit the family business." Until I opened the voicemail she left me. I looked at her and said, "Want me to play the part where you admit you stole from my dad?" I quit my family's business on a Tuesday morning after staring at the same accounting spreadsheet for almost an hour and realizing there was a payment on it that I could not explain. The amount was $7,850. It was not the biggest transaction the company had made that month, so by itself it did not look suspicious. What bothered me was the name attached to it. It was a company I had never heard of, and the payment had been approved under my dad's login. My dad had been dead for 11 months. That was the moment I stopped believing I had simply made a mistake. I wish I could say I immediately understood what was happening, but I didn't. I spent the next several days doing what I think a lot of people do. When something terrible starts forming in front of them, I tried to find a harmless explanation. I checked the invoice number. I checked the vendor file. I checked the bank account. I checked the email archive. I even checked old paper folders in the office because my dad had a habit of printing things that everybody else kept digitally. Nothing explained the payment. The company was a small commercial equipment business that my grandfather had started and my dad had taken over. We sold and serviced equipment for restaurants, grocery stores, warehouses, and a few independent contractors. It was not glamorous. There were delivery trucks in the parking lot, guys walking around with steel-toed boots, customers calling about broken refrigeration units, and stacks of invoices that always seemed to multiply overnight. My dad loved the business. He loved working with his hands even though he technically had not needed to for years. He knew most of our customers by first name. He knew which restaurants always paid late. He knew which suppliers would give him a discount if he called instead of emailing. He also trusted family far more than he should have. That was probably his biggest weakness. My Aunt Denise had worked there for almost 20 years. She was my dad's younger sister. She handled payroll, vendor payments, and most of the office administration. My dad trusted her completely. I had always assumed that made sense. She was family. She had been there longer than most of the employees. When my grandfather died, she was one of the people who kept the company running while my dad dealt with the funeral and estate paperwork. When my dad got sick, she was the person who knew which forms needed signatures and which customers needed calls. After my dad died, I became the majority owner because he had left the business to me. That was not something I had expected. I was 34. I had worked at the company off and on since I was a teenager, but I had spent most of my adult life doing something else. I understood operations. I understood sales. I knew the employees. I knew the customers. I did not understand accounting nearly as well as Denise did. That became important very quickly. For the first few months after my dad's death, I was mostly trying to keep the company alive. I was grieving. I was also trying to figure out how to run a business while making sure payroll cleared every other Friday. Denise told me I did not need to worry about the books because she had everything under control. I believed her. Looking back, that sentence embarrasses me more than anything else. Not because I trusted my aunt, because I trusted her without verifying anything. The strange payment appeared during a routine review my accountant had asked me to do. Our accountant was an outside CPA who had worked with my dad for years. She had started asking more questions because the company's expenses had increased even though revenue had remained relatively steady. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to make her want to understand the change. She wanted me to review a list of vendor payments before she closed out the quarter. I did not know what most of the vendor names meant. That was normal. The company had hundreds of suppliers. The first few payments I looked at were ordinary. Then I saw the $7,850 payment. The vendor name looked like it belonged to an equipment repair company. The invoice was for emergency compressor work. The payment had been approved 3 days after my dad's death anniversary. I pulled up the invoice. There was a PDF attached. It looked legitimate. There was a logo, there was a phone number, there was a list of parts, there was a service charge, there was even a technician name. But the invoice number did not match the formatting used by our other vendors. That was the first thing that made me uncomfortable. The second thing was the bank account. The vendor had been paid electronically. The account had been added to our payment system 6 weeks before. The person who added it was listed as Denise. I stared at the screen for several minutes. I called her. She sounded irritated that I was calling during working hours. I asked if she recognized the company. She immediately said yes. She said it was a new subcontractor for emergency work. I asked why I had never heard of them. She told me I didn't need to know every vendor. That answer bothered me more than I expected. I asked which customer had required the compressor repair. She hesitated. Then she said she would look it up. 5 minutes later, she emailed me the invoice and told me the paperwork was all there. I checked the customer name. It was one of our regular restaurant accounts. I called them. The manager who answered knew our company, but he said they had not requested any emergency compressor work. I remember sitting in my office with my hand on the phone and feeling this cold sensation in my chest. I asked him whether their refrigeration system had been serviced recently. He said no. I thanked him and hung up. I did not accuse Denise of anything. I didn't even tell her what I had just learned. I went home that night and barely slept. The next morning I printed the payment record, then I printed the vendor setup record, then I printed the invoice. I put all three into a folder and brought them to my CPA. She studied them without saying much. Then she asked me to bring every payment made to that vendor. There were 12. The total was $68,400. I felt sick. I asked whether that meant Denise had stolen $68,400. My CPA said she could not tell me that. She said there might be legitimate explanations. She also said I needed to stop confronting anyone until we understood what the records showed. That was harder than it sounds. I had been raised to solve problems by talking to people. My dad was the same way. If there was an employee dispute, he would sit them down. If a customer was upset, he would call. If a supplier made a mistake, he would explain the situation. But my CPA was right. This was no longer just an argument. There were financial records involved, so I started keeping copies. I exported the payment history. I made copies of the vendor file. I saved emails. I printed bank statements. I made a spreadsheet showing every questionable transaction. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not even my mother. That felt terrible. My mother was still struggling with my dad's death, and she hated conflict. She had always viewed Denise as the responsible sister. At family gatherings, Denise was the one who organized everything. She brought food. She remembered birthdays. She sent thank you notes. She was the person everybody called when something went wrong. I could already hear what my mother would say. She would tell me there had to be an explanation. For a while, I hoped there was. Then I found another payment. This one was for $4,200. The vendor was a business that supposedly supplied replacement control boards. Again, the customer listed on the invoice had no record of the purchase. I called the vendor. The person on the phone told me they had never done business with us. I asked for a copy of the invoice they had supposedly sent. They said the invoice number didn't exist. I hung up and stared at my computer. 2 fake vendors, more than $72,000, both created by Denise. Both approved through company accounts. I still did not understand the whole picture, and that uncertainty bothered me because I did not want to accuse someone I loved based on incomplete information. I started going through older records. That was when I found my dad's handwritten notes. My dad kept a small notebook in his desk. He used it for everything: parts numbers, customer names, phone numbers, appointments, random reminders. After he died, I had put it in a drawer because I could not bring myself to throw it away. I opened it again. Most of the pages were meaningless. Then I found a note dated about 4 months before he died. It said that he was concerned about unexplained vendor increases. Underneath that, he had written Denise's initials. That stopped me cold. I kept reading. There were several short entries about payments that did not make sense. He had written down 3 vendor names. 2 of them were now familiar. They were 2 of the same companies I had been investigating. I sat there for almost 20 minutes. That was the moment the story changed for me. Until then, part of me had wondered whether Denise had somehow started doing something wrong after my dad died. Now I knew the problem might have started while he was still alive. I called my CPA again. I brought her the notebook. She told me not to take it anywhere. She scanned the pages and gave them back to me. Then she asked when my dad had become seriously ill. I told her. She asked whether his access to the company accounts had changed near the end. I said Denise had handled most of the financial work while he was in the hospital. My CPA looked at me for a long time. She said there were too many questions now to treat this as an accounting mistake. She recommended I hire an attorney who handled business disputes and financial fraud. I did. The attorney was calm, almost frustratingly calm. He did not act shocked. He asked for documents, bank statements, payroll records, vendor files, corporate records, emails, tax returns, everything. I spent almost 3 weeks gathering paperwork, and the more I found, the worse it became. There were payments to companies that did not exist. There were checks written to real companies with altered invoice numbers. There were reimbursements for meals and supplies that nobody remembered. There were several transfers between company accounts and an account that had Denise's name on it. The largest transfer was $32,000. The description said it was a reimbursement for equipment purchases. There was no equipment. There was no purchase. There was no receipt. The money had gone into Denise's personal account. My hands actually started shaking when I saw it. I remember thinking that I had spent almost a year telling myself I was lucky to have my aunt helping me. Meanwhile, she had been taking money from the company my father built. I wanted to confront her. My attorney told me not to. He said the goal was not to make Denise confess. The goal was to establish what happened. That distinction ended up changing everything. I went back to work the next morning and acted normal. That was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Denise still came into my office to discuss payroll. She still complained about the price of coffee. She still asked whether I wanted her to order lunch for the office. I would look at her and know things she didn't realize I knew, but I did not say anything. She did not appear nervous. That made me doubt myself all over again. I started wondering whether there really was some explanation. Maybe the transfers had been loans. Maybe my dad had approved something I did not understand. Maybe the paperwork was incomplete. Maybe Denise had permission to move the money. My attorney kept telling me to wait. Then we found the most important thing, a folder in my dad's old office. It was labeled with a vendor name. Inside were printed bank records from months before he died. At the top of one page, my dad had written a note in pen. He had circled several transfers. He had written that he wanted to ask Denise about them. The date was less than 2 weeks before his hospitalization. Underneath that note was another one. He had written that if he could not deal with the issue himself, I should have the company books reviewed independently. I had to leave the office. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and cried, not because of the money, not entirely. It was because my dad had known something was wrong. He had been trying to figure it out while he was sick, and I had no idea. When I got home that evening, my mother called. She told me Denise had been complaining about me. Apparently, I had become distant. Apparently, I was acting strangely. Apparently, I was making Denise uncomfortable by asking too many questions. I said I was dealing with the business. My mother told me I needed to be careful because family relationships could be damaged permanently by suspicion. I said I understood. She asked whether I was accusing Denise of stealing. I didn't answer. That silence told her enough. She started crying. I immediately felt guilty. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She asked whether I had evidence. I said I was still looking at records. She told me that was not an answer. I told her I would talk to her when I knew more. That was the first time I realized this was going to destroy more than a business relationship. A week later, Denise quit. At least that was what she told everybody. She gathered the office staff together and announced that she was leaving because I had made it impossible for her to work there. She said I did not trust her. She said I had changed since my dad died. She said she had dedicated 20 years to the company and was being treated like a criminal. She did not say the word criminal. She did not have to. The employees knew there was a problem. I did not make a public accusation. I told everyone that Denise was no longer with the company and that the business was moving forward. That was it. But the family reaction was immediate. My cousin called me. My mother called me. My uncle called me. Everybody wanted to know what had happened. I refused to explain until my attorney told me I could. That made me look guilty to some people. It was awful. At Thanksgiving, Denise sat across from me at my mother's house. It was the first time I had seen her since she left. Nobody talked about the business at first. Everybody acted like we were just eating dinner. The turkey was dry. My cousin's kids were running around the house. The television was on in the background. Then Denise started talking. She told everyone she had been pushed out. She said I was overwhelmed and looking for someone to blame. She said my dad would have been ashamed of how I was treating her. That hurt. That one sentence almost broke the restraint I had been holding on to. I wanted to tell them everything. Instead, I said I was not discussing the business at Thanksgiving. Denise laughed. She said that was because I had nothing to say. I got up from the table. I went into the kitchen. My hands were shaking. My mother followed me. She asked me to leave the business alone for the family. I told her I could not do that. She asked whether the money was worth destroying the family. I remember staring at her. I said it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about my dad. She didn't understand. I didn't explain. I couldn't. A few days later, my attorney told me the records were strong enough that we could send a formal demand. The amount was significant. But the bigger issue was whether Denise would cooperate. She didn't. Instead, her attorney responded by accusing me of financial mismanagement. They claimed that I had improperly removed her from the business. They claimed she had made transfers with my dad's permission. They demanded that the company produce certain records. That scared me. Not because I thought the records would hurt me, because suddenly everything was becoming legal. I had never been involved in a business dispute like this. I had never hired an attorney to communicate with someone in my family. I started questioning every decision I'd made since my dad died. One mistake stood out. I had given Denise access to almost everything because I assumed she was protecting my father's business. Now I was the one protecting it from her. The investigation continued. We discovered that Denise had been using a second email address for some vendor communications. That address was attached to several invoices. The messages were short. Most were just requests for payment information, but they included account numbers. One message contained an attachment showing a payment instruction. The bank account was Denise's. My attorney said that was important. Still, there was one thing missing. We did not have a direct admission. We had records, we had transfers, we had fake vendors, we had altered invoices, we had evidence that my dad had been concerned before he died. But we did not have Denise saying she had done it. That changed 4 months later, and it happened in the stupidest way possible. I had gone to my mother's house to pick up some old family photographs. My mother had been cleaning out a closet. She had boxes from my dad's office. I found a small digital recorder in one of them. My dad used it to record notes when he was driving. I didn't know whether it still worked. I almost threw it away. Then I saw a file dated about 3 weeks before he went into the hospital. I played it. My dad sounded tired. His voice was weaker than I remembered. He talked about the business. He talked about being worried about money. Then he said he was going to ask Denise about several payments. He said he did not want a family fight. He said he just wanted an explanation. The recording ended. I sat on the floor with the recorder in my hand. I cried again, not because it solved anything, because I suddenly understood that my dad had known he was in trouble and had been trying to handle it quietly. I gave the recording to my attorney. He told me it could be useful, but he did not want to rely on it alone. We still needed records, so we kept going. Then, unexpectedly, Denise called me. She wanted to meet. I almost said no. My attorney told me that if I agreed, it needed to be somewhere public and I needed to keep the conversation calm. We met at a coffee shop. I remember how normal it felt. People were ordering muffins. Someone was typing on a laptop. A child was crying near the counter. Meanwhile, my aunt was sitting across from me with the same expression she had worn at every family dinner for the last 20 years. She looked exhausted. She told me she had made mistakes. That was the first time she said it. She said she had taken money from the business. She said she had intended to repay it. She said my dad knew about some of it. She said he had been struggling financially and sometimes let her move money around. I asked why the transfers had gone into her personal account. She said she had borrowed it. I asked about the fake vendors. She said those were created because she needed temporary ways to move money without certain employees seeing it. That answer made no sense to me. I asked why she had never told me. She said she knew I would judge her. She said after my dad died, she panicked. She said she kept taking money because she believed she could fix everything later. That was the first time I realized there might not be a single moment where Denise decided to steal. It might have started as one bad decision, then another, then another. Then years of lying became easier than admitting the truth. I asked how much she had taken. She looked down. She said she didn't know. My attorney later calculated it at just over $180,000. I felt numb. She had taken money over several years, not all at once, not in some dramatic scheme. Small amounts, medium amounts, occasional large transfers. Enough that the business could survive while the losses stayed hidden. I did not tell her about the recorder that day. I didn't know whether I should. Instead, I told her she needed to speak to her attorney. She asked whether I was going to report her. I said I wasn't making decisions based on anger. I told her the records would determine what happened next. She cried. She said my dad would not have wanted this. That sentence bothered me, because my dad had already told me what he wanted. He had written it down, he had recorded it. He had been trying to protect the company. I did not say that. I simply left. The next month was miserable. The lawyers negotiated. There were meetings. There were documents. There were demands and responses. My insurance company got involved because we had a business crime policy that might cover part of the loss. Our CPA reconstructed years of financial records. We found charges that we had missed before. Some were embarrassingly small. One was a $96 hardware store purchase. Another was a $47 restaurant bill. But together they showed a pattern. It was not just one theft. It was a long period of unauthorized personal spending. The strangest part was how ordinary it looked. That was what made it so hard to understand. There was no locked safe, no secret room, no dramatic disappearance. There were spreadsheets, bank statements, expense reports, emails, transfers. That was it. The evidence was boring, and somehow that made it more convincing. Eventually, Denise agreed to a settlement. She signed an acknowledgement of the amount owed. She agreed to repay a portion immediately from savings and investments. The rest was secured by assets and paid over time. My attorney explained that collecting every dollar might take years. The insurance claim covered another portion. We also changed the company's financial controls. No one person could add a vendor and approve a payment anymore. Payments above a certain threshold needed 2 approvals. Bank statements were reviewed monthly by someone outside the company. I hated that it had taken this much pain to learn those lessons, but I learned them. The criminal side was separate. My attorney explained that whether authorities pursued charges depended on the evidence and the applicable laws. I did not make a public demand for prison. I did not make threats. I simply provided the records when asked. After the referral, investigators contacted me. They reviewed the documents. They interviewed employees. They examined the bank records. They asked me questions about my dad. I answered every question honestly. Months later, Denise was charged with multiple counts related to the financial conduct. I did not celebrate. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined confronting whoever hurt my family. I thought I would feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. She was still my aunt. She had been at my childhood birthday parties. She had helped my parents when I was young. She had given me my first job. Knowing someone had done something terrible did not erase the good memories. It just changed what those memories meant. The family fractured after that. Some relatives blamed me. Some blamed Denise. Some refused to talk about it. My mother stopped attending family gatherings for a while. She said she could not stand being in the same room with everyone arguing over my dad. I understood. My cousin, who had initially defended Denise, eventually apologized. He said he had believed her, because she had always been the person who organized everything. He admitted he had confused competence with honesty. That sentence stayed with me because I had done the same thing. I had assumed that because Denise knew how to run the office, she must be protecting the business. I had mistaken familiarity for trustworthiness. A year after I discovered the first payment, my aunt sent me a letter. I almost threw it away. Instead, I read it. She wrote that she had spent years convincing herself the money was temporary. She said she told herself she deserved it because of how much she had done for the family. She said after my grandfather died, she believed my dad would always take care of her. She said when my dad started getting sick, she became afraid of what would happen to her if the business changed. She admitted that fear had slowly turned into entitlement. She did not ask me to forgive her. That mattered. She said she understood if I never wanted a relationship with her again. I put the letter in a drawer. I still have it. I have not answered. Maybe someday I will. Maybe I won't. I don't know. There was one part of the whole thing that I still struggle with, the voicemail. I haven't forgotten it. The voicemail happened after she had already left the company. At the time, the family was still divided. Some people believed I had forced her out because I wanted complete control. Some believed she had simply made bookkeeping mistakes. Denise called my phone one Sunday night. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. I listened to it the next morning. She sounded angry. She said I was embarrassing myself. She said everyone knew I had quit because I couldn't handle the pressure of running the business. She said I was too embarrassed to tell anyone why I had really quit. But I had not quit. I had resigned from running the day-to-day operation for a short period so I could restructure the company and deal with the investigation. That was what she was referring to. She was trying to make it sound like I had failed. I saved the voicemail. I never imagined I would play it in front of the family. But 3 weeks later, we all ended up in the same room. It was my grandmother's birthday. She was the last person in the family who had not been told the full story because we wanted to protect her. Unfortunately, family secrets do not stay secret. Denise started talking about me. She said I had ruined everything. She said my dad would have been disappointed. Then she looked directly at me and laughed. She said I was too embarrassed to tell anyone why I had quit the family business. I remember how strangely calm I felt. Maybe because I had spent so long dealing with documents that words no longer frightened me. I asked her whether she wanted me to play the voicemail. Everyone became quiet. She stopped smiling. I took out my phone. I played it. Nobody interrupted. They heard her accuse me of being ashamed. They heard the anger in her voice. Then I told everyone what had actually happened. I did not exaggerate. I did not call her names. I didn't even raise my voice. I explained that the company had lost more than $180,000. I explained that the payments had gone into her personal account. I explained that there were fake vendors. I explained that my dad had discovered suspicious transactions before he died. I explained that I had not immediately accused her because I wanted to know the truth. Then I told them that she had admitted taking the money. The room went completely silent. She looked at me and then looked at the others. I had expected anger. Instead, she looked tired. She said she had been desperate. I believed her. That did not excuse what she had done, but it helped me understand it. My mother started crying. My cousin walked outside. My uncle sat there with his head down. My grandmother simply held my hand. That was probably the hardest family gathering I have ever been through. It was also the first time I stopped wondering whether I had been wrong. Not because everyone agreed with me. Not because I had gotten revenge. Because the facts were finally out in the open. I had spent months being called paranoid. I had spent months wondering whether I was betraying my own family by asking questions. I had spent months feeling like the bad guy because I was the person who refused to let things stay hidden. Once the records were on the table, none of that mattered anymore. The company survived. That was the part I cared about most. We had to make changes. We lost some money. We lost Denise. We lost some family relationships, but the employees stayed. Most of our customers stayed. The business became more organized. I hired a full-time controller. I stopped assuming that knowing someone for 20 years meant I understood what they were capable of doing. I reviewed contracts. I reviewed insurance. I learned things about payroll, taxes, vendor management, and banking that I had never wanted to know. I also started taking Fridays off. That might sound unrelated. It isn't. For years, my dad had worked constantly. He would leave before breakfast and come home exhausted. Even after the business was successful, he still acted like everything would collapse if he took a day away. After he died, I started doing the same thing. I thought that was what being responsible meant. It took me a long time to understand that running a business is not the same thing as giving your entire life to it. The weirdest part is that I don't hate my aunt. I thought I would. For a while, I did. There were days when I wanted to erase her from every family photograph. Then I would remember something good she had done. She had been there when my dad had surgery. She had driven my mother to appointments. She had brought food after the funeral. Those things were real, so were the thefts. People are capable of both. That was probably the hardest lesson for me. I wanted everyone to be either good or bad. It would have been easier. Instead, I learned that someone can love you and still betray you. Someone can believe they are justified and still cause serious harm. Someone can spend 20 years helping build a business and still steal from it. And someone can make a terrible decision without thinking of themselves as a terrible person. None of that changes the consequences. My aunt eventually entered a guilty plea. She was ordered to pay restitution. She lost most of her professional standing. The company recovered part of the money. The rest is still being repaid. I don't know whether I will ever get every dollar back. At this point, I don't need to. The business is worth more than the money we lost, not financially. I mean that I finally know how to protect it. My dad wanted me to own the company. He never expected me to spend my 30s learning how fraud works, but I think he would understand why I did it. Sometimes I still go into his old office. The desk is gone now. The carpet has been replaced. The walls have been painted, but I kept his notebook. I also kept that old digital recorder. I don't listen to it often. Once every few months, maybe. His voice sounds younger than I remember. That is strange because he was sick when he made the recording. I hear him talking about the business. I hear him worrying about money. I hear him trying to avoid hurting Denise. And I hear the same instinct I had for most of my life. He wanted to give family the benefit of the doubt. I understand that now. I also understand something else. Trust is not the same thing as refusing to look. For years, I thought checking records meant you didn't trust people. Now I think checking records is one of the ways you protect the people you actually trust. I wish I had learned that before my dad died. Maybe I would have noticed something sooner. Maybe I would have asked better questions. Maybe things would have been different. I will never know. What I do know is that the first payment was only $7,850. At the time, it felt like an impossible amount. I thought finding that one payment had ruined my family. In reality, finding it gave me the chance to understand what had already been happening. The spreadsheet did not expose my aunt. The spreadsheet simply made it impossible for me to keep ignoring what I had been seeing. The bank records did the rest. The invoices did the rest. The vendor records did the rest. My dad's notes filled in the gaps, and eventually my aunt admitted enough that I no longer needed to guess. I think that is why the voicemail stayed with me. She thought I was ashamed. She thought the easiest way to control the story was to make me look like a failure. She assumed that because I wasn't yelling, I didn't have anything. She had no idea that by then I had a folder full of bank statements sitting in my desk. I had copies of invoices. I had vendor records. I had emails. I had my dad's notes. I had legal representation. And I had learned something I wish I had understood much earlier. You don't have to win an argument when the truth is already documented. You just have to stop getting in its way. My aunt wanted everyone to think I quit because I was embarrassed. The truth was that I stepped back because I was trying to keep the company from collapsing while I figured out where the money had gone. She wanted me to explain myself emotionally. I explained it with records. That difference changed everything. A few months after the family gathering, I received another voicemail. This one was from my mother. She said she was proud of me. She said she had not understood what I was carrying at the time. She apologized for asking me to protect the family before I had even had the chance to protect myself. I sat in my truck and listened to that message twice. Then I deleted it, not because it didn't matter, because I didn't need to keep proof of that one. Some things can just be true. My relationship with my mother is better now. My cousin and I talk regularly. My uncle still avoids discussing the business. I don't blame him. Family gatherings are smaller. People are more careful. There is an awkwardness that probably will never disappear completely. But there is also something else. Nobody pretends anymore, and honestly, that has been a strange kind of relief. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a family was losing money. It isn't. The worst thing is when everyone starts protecting the version of the family that they wish were true instead of dealing with the family that actually exists. For a long time, I wanted my aunt to admit what she had done so I could finally feel vindicated. When she eventually admitted it, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt relieved. Mostly, I felt like I could finally stop investigating my own family. That was almost 2 years ago. The business is still running. We are doing well. There are new employees who have never even met Denise. To them, she is just a name in some old records. Sometimes that feels strange. They don't know how important she once was. They don't know she used to sit behind the front desk every morning. They don't know she knew every customer. They don't know my dad trusted her. They don't know what happened, and I don't tell them. There is no reason to. The business doesn't belong to that story anymore. It belongs to the people who stayed. It belongs to my dad's memory. It belongs to the employees who show up every day and do their jobs honestly. And it belongs to me. The biggest thing I learned is that staying calm does not mean you are weak. Sometimes staying calm is the only reason you get to the truth. I could have confronted Denise the first day I saw that payment. I could have accused her in front of the employees. I could have called every relative and told them she was stealing. I could have made a scene at Thanksgiving. I could have demanded an apology. Instead, I kept copies. I asked questions. I checked records. I hired professionals. I waited. It was frustrating. It was humiliating. There were nights when I wanted to throw everything across my office. But every time I felt that way, I remembered my dad's handwriting in that notebook. He had not written that I should get revenge. He had written that I should have the books reviewed independently. That was all, so that's what I did. I suppose in the end that was the only victory I really needed, not seeing my aunt embarrassed, not watching her lose, not hearing her admit she was wrong. Just knowing that when the time came to choose between protecting the appearance of my family and protecting the truth, I finally chose the truth. And when she looked at me at that birthday dinner and tried to make my silence sound like shame, I realized something I hadn't understood until then. I wasn't embarrassed about why I left. I was embarrassed that I had ever trusted someone so completely that I never thought to look. I'm not embarrassed about that anymore. I think most people who get betrayed spend a lot of time asking themselves how they could have been so stupid. I've stopped asking myself that. I was trusting. I was grieving. I was inexperienced. I made assumptions. Those are mistakes. They are not crimes. What my aunt did was her responsibility. What I did afterward was mine, and I can live with the part that belongs to me. The company still has my dad's original sign hanging above the front office. I considered replacing it when we renovated. I didn't. Every morning when I walk in, I see it. Sometimes I think about everything that happened after he died. The fake vendors, the bank statements, the arguments, the lawyers, the family dinners, the voicemail, the paperwork, the money, the things I learned, the people who stayed, the people who didn't. Then I turn on the lights and start work. That's probably the most satisfying ending I could have asked for, not revenge. Not some dramatic family victory. Just walking into the business my dad left me knowing that I protected it when it mattered. And knowing that this time, nobody is going to convince me to look away from the numbers because they happen to share my last name.